Picture this. It's a crisp autumn morning in 1347, and you're walking through the cobblestone streets of a bustling medieval town. The air is thick with the scent of bread-baking horses and something else, something you can't quite place. You notice a man ahead of you wearing a peculiar outfit. His sleeves are bright yellow, almost golden in the morning light, but stitched with red stripes in a pattern that makes your eyes ache. On his chest, a circular badge catches the sunlight. He walks with his head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone he passes. You've just encountered someone living under one of history's strangest legal requirements. By law, this man must dress exactly this way. His clothing isn't a fashion choice or religious garment. It's a legal mandate, enforced by authorities who could fine, imprison, or worse if he dared to dress like everyone else. This was the reality of sumptuary laws, regulations that dictated not just what you could wear, but who you could be in public. To modernize, it seems like the ultimate invasion of personal freedom. But in the medieval world, these laws weren't born from tyranny. They were born from necessity. The medieval mind operated on a principle we've largely forgotten. Everything had its place, and that place was sacred. Society was viewed as a living organism where each part had a specific function. Disturb that balance, and the entire system could collapse. Clothing laws weren't about oppression. They were about survival. Consider the economic reality. In a world without mass production, fabric was precious beyond our modern comprehension. A single bolt of silk could cost more than a peasant's annual income. Purple dye, extracted from thousands of murex shells, was literally worth more than gold. When someone wore clothing above their station, they weren't just making a fashion statement. They were potentially bankrupting their family, disrupting local economies, and creating social tensions that could explode into violence. But there's something deeper here, something that reveals the medieval soul. These laws protected what we might call social legibility. In a world without identification cards, uniforms, or modern markers of profession and status, clothing told stories. A merchant's fur-trimmed coat wasn't vanity. It was a business card. A noble's silk sleeves weren't decoration. They were credentials. When someone dressed above their station, they weren't just breaking fashion rules. They were creating dangerous confusion in a world where mistaken identity could mean the difference between respect and execution. The yellow and red stripes you witnessed weren't random. They marked someone the medieval world feared above all others: a usurer, a moneylender. In an age when lending money for profit was considered a sin against God Himself, these individuals occupied a strange space between necessity and damnation. Society needed them, but couldn't accept them. The clothing laws solved this paradox by making them visible, creating a buffer zone of recognition that protected both the usurer and their clients. But clothing laws were just the beginning. Let's walk deeper into this medieval town and discover rules that seem even stranger. As evening approaches, you hear a sound that makes your blood run cold, not because it's threatening, but because it's so alien to modern ears. A bell tolls, not calling people to church, but commanding them to extinguish every flame in their homes. Candles, hearth fires, oil lamps, all must be snuffed out at the sound of this curfew bell. Within minutes, an entire town plunges into darkness. The couvre-feu, literally cover fire, seems like medieval oppression at its worst. Imagine being forced to sit in complete darkness for hours, unable to read, work, or even see your family's faces clearly. Yet this rule saved countless thousands of lives. Medieval towns were tinderboxes waiting to explode, houses built of wood and thatch, pressed together like matchsticks. Streets so narrow you could touch buildings on both sides with outstretched arms. A single forgotten candle could turn an entire district into an inferno within minutes. The Great Fire of London in 1666 started with one baker's oven and consumed over 13,000 houses. Medieval authorities had witnessed such disasters countless times, and the curfew bell was their solution. But the darkness served another purpose. In a world without police forces or street lighting, night brought dangers we can barely imagine. Thieves, murderers, and worse prowled the shadows. Wild animals wandered into towns from nearby forests. Even honest citizens became threats after too much ale. The curfew didn't just prevent fires, it prevented the chaos that darkness could unleash. Yet there's poetry in this forced darkness. Families gathered closer around dying embers. Stories were told that might have been forgotten in brighter light. The medieval night became a time of intimacy and reflection that our electrically illuminated world has lost forever. As we continue our journey through these seemingly strange laws, we encounter rules that govern something even more fundamental than clothing or fire. Food itself was regulated in ways that would astound modern diners. Imagine sitting down to your evening meal and discovering that the law has decided what you can and cannot eat, not based on health concerns or dietary restrictions, but based on your social position and the calendar itself. For nearly half the year, meat was forbidden to everyone, regardless of wealth or status. Fish became the reluctant substitute, appearing on tables from the humblest peasant cottage to the grandest noble hall. These weren't arbitrary religious rules designed to make life miserable. They were sophisticated economic and ecological policies disguised as spiritual mandates. Medieval Europe lived perpetually on the edge of famine. One bad harvest could mean starvation for thousands. Cattle, pigs, and chickens weren't just food sources. They were living insurance policies. A cow provided milk, pulled plows, and eventually gave leather. Kill it for meat, and you lost all future benefits. The church's fasting laws forced people to think long-term, to preserve breeding stock that would ensure survival through lean years. What seemed like religious oppression was actually medieval Europe's version of environmental conservation. The fish trade that emerged from these laws created entire economies. Coastal towns specialized in preservation techniques, developing methods of salting, smoking, and drying that allowed fish to travel hundreds of miles inland. Monasteries became centers of aquaculture, breeding fish in artificial ponds. What began as a dietary restriction evolved into a complex network of trade, innovation, and economic opportunity. But perhaps most fascinating of all was how these food laws created a parallel culture of creativity. Denied meat, medieval cooks became masters of deception. They crafted elaborate dishes from nuts, grains, and vegetables that mimicked the textures and flavors of forbidden foods. Almond milk became a substitute for dairy. Elaborate spice combinations created the illusion of meat flavors. The medieval kitchen became a laboratory of culinary innovation born from legal necessity. Yet even these food laws pale in comparison to regulations that govern something we take completely for granted today. The very act of hunting for survival was transformed into a crime that could cost a peasant his life. Picture a family on the edge of starvation. Their grain stores are empty. Their last coin spent on bread that's mostly sawdust. In the forest just beyond their village, deer graze peacefully, rabbits multiply in the underbrush, and wild birds fill the trees. Nature's bounty surrounds them, yet touching any of it means death. Forest laws created a parallel universe where the natural world belonged exclusively to the nobility. Not just the large game like deer and boar, but every living creature down to the smallest songbird. Even fallen branches and nuts were off limits to common people. The punishment for poaching wasn't just harsh, it was deliberately terrifying, designed to serve as a warning to others. Yet these laws weren't simply about hoarding resources. They reflected a medieval understanding of land ownership that went far deeper than modern property rights. Nobles didn't just own the forest, they were responsible for it. Hunting wasn't recreation, it was management. Deer populations left unchecked could destroy crops for miles around. Wild boar could kill livestock and even people. The exclusive hunting rights came with the obligation to maintain ecological balance. The irony runs deeper still. While peasants starved, looking longingly at game they couldn't touch, the nobles who hunted often did so wastefully, killing for sport rather than sustenance. Hunting parties might slaughter hundreds of animals in a single day, far more than could be consumed. The very abundance that could have fed the hungry was destroyed in displays of power and privilege. But hidden within these harsh forest laws was a form of medieval environmentalism. By restricting access, authorities inadvertently created wildlife preserves centuries before the concept formally existed. Forests remained intact, species survived, and ecosystems maintained their balance. The cruel irony is that laws designed to exclude the poor may have saved the natural world from the kind of destruction that unchecked exploitation might have caused. These weren't the only ways medieval authorities controlled the most basic human needs. Even more fundamental than hunting was the simple act of moving grain into flour, bread into sustenance. And here too, laws that seemed designed purely to frustrate revealed deeper purposes when examined closely. Every village had its mill, and every mill had its monopoly. By law, peasants couldn't grind their grain anywhere else, couldn't even own hand mills in their homes. They had to bring their precious wheat and barley to the Lord's mill, pay his fees, and accept whatever quality of flour he provided. Attempt to grind grain secretly and face fines that could cost more than the grain itself was worth. This seems like pure exploitation, and often it was. But mill monopolies also solved problems that aren't immediately obvious. Mills were expensive, complex machines requiring constant maintenance and skilled operation. In a world of scarce resources, having multiple mills in one area meant none could operate efficiently. The monopoly system ensured that communities had reliable access to grain processing even if the cost was high. The story of medieval laws is ultimately a story about survival in a world that was far more fragile than ours. Every strange regulation, every seemingly arbitrary rule emerged from real problems that demanded real solutions. More than survival, these laws reveal something profound about how medieval people understood justice itself. They lived in a world where truth wasn't determined by evidence or witnesses, but by divine intervention. Welcome to the realm of trial by ordeal, where God Himself was expected to serve as judge and jury. Imagine standing accused of theft in a medieval court. The evidence against you is thin, perhaps nothing more than suspicion and whispered accusations. In our world, you might expect lawyers, testimony, careful examination of facts. But in medieval Europe, justice took a different form entirely. The judge approaches you with a bar of iron, glowing red from the forge. Your innocence or guilt will be determined not by what you've done, but by how your flesh heals after you're forced to carry this burning metal 3 paces. The logic was beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its consequences. If God knew you were innocent, He would protect you from harm. The iron wouldn't burn, or if it did, the wound would heal cleanly within 3 days. But if you were guilty, divine justice would manifest through your suffering. Your hand would fester, infection would set in, and your guilt would be written in your own flesh. These weren't the ravings of primitive minds. They were carefully constructed legal procedures that solved a fundamental problem: how to determine truth in a world without forensic science, without reliable witnesses, where perjury was common and corruption endemic. When human judgment failed, medieval authorities turned to what they believed was a higher power. The ordeal by water offered another path to divine judgment. Bound hand and foot, the accused would be lowered into a pond or river. If you sank, struggling helplessly beneath the surface, you were innocent, though possibly drowned by the time they pulled you up. If you floated, the pure water had rejected you as a liar, proving your guilt beyond any earthly doubt. The twisted logic reveals medieval Europe's relationship with the natural world. Water was seen as pure, incapable of deception. It would embrace the innocent and reject the guilty with the reliability of a natural law. That innocent people might drown while guilty ones survived was explained away through theological reasoning too complex for most to follow. Perhaps strangest of all was trial by combat, where legal disputes were settled through ritualized violence. 2 men would fight, often to the death, with the survivor declared righteous by virtue of victory. God, it was believed, would strengthen the arm of the innocent and weaken the guilty. Justice became a matter of sword skill and physical prowess, rather than legal argument. Yet, even these seemingly barbaric practices served purposes beyond mere superstition. They were public spectacles that reinforced social order, dramatic displays that reminded everyone of the consequences of transgression. More practically, they often encouraged confessions. Faced with the prospect of carrying molten metal or fighting a trained warrior, many accused people chose to admit guilt rather than face ordeal, speeding up legal processes in courts overwhelmed by cases. The church eventually banned trials by ordeal in the 13th century, partly because too many innocent people were suffering, and partly because the practice began to seem uncomfortably similar to testing God rather than seeking His judgment. But for centuries, these procedures were the backbone of medieval justice, reflecting a world where the boundary between earthly and divine authority was fluid, where miracles were expected parts of daily legal procedure. As we move deeper into medieval law, we encounter regulations that govern something even more intimate than justice. The very rhythms of daily life were controlled by authorities who understood that time itself could be a tool of social order. The sound begins before dawn, cutting through the morning mist with bronze authority. Church bells, not content to simply call the faithful to prayer, dictated every moment of medieval life with mechanical precision. When to wake, when to work, when to eat, when to sleep. These weren't suggestions, but commands backed by legal force and social pressure. The bells created what we might call temporal tyranny. Your personal sense of time, your body's natural rhythms, your family's needs, all became secondary to the bronze voice of authority. Miss the morning bell, and everyone knew you were lazy. Ignore the work bell, and face questions about your commitment to community obligations. The bells didn't just mark time, they owned it. Yet this acoustic dictatorship solved problems that plagued every medieval community. Without clocks, without universal literacy, without any way to coordinate activities across large groups of people, the bells provided the only reliable method of social synchronization. They ensured that markets opened simultaneously, that workers appeared when needed, that religious obligations were fulfilled on schedule. The bells also created safety through predictability. In a world where darkness brought danger, where bandits and wild animals posed constant threats, knowing that entire communities moved in unison provided security. Criminals couldn't rely on catching individuals alone if everyone followed the same schedule. The temporal structure became a form of collective protection. But there's something almost musical about how medieval life unfolded to these bronze rhythms. The day began with lauds, flowed through terce, sext, and none, reached its peak at vespers, and concluded with compline. Each moment had its name, its purpose, its place in the larger symphony of community life. The bells didn't just tell time, they created a shared experience of temporality that bound medieval society together in ways our individualized world has lost. Even more personal than time was something we consider a basic human need. The simple act of keeping clean, of washing away the grime and sweat of daily labor. Yet medieval authorities found ways to regulate even this most private of activities. Bathhouses, those steamy refuges where people could scrub away weeks of accumulated dirt, were viewed with deep suspicion by medieval lawmakers. Not because cleanliness was discouraged, but because bathhouses had evolved into something far more complex than simple washing facilities. They had become social centers, places where business was conducted, gossip exchanged, and relationships formed outside the watchful eyes of family and church. The authorities weren't entirely wrong in their concerns. Medieval bathhouses operated in moral gray areas that made religious leaders uncomfortable. Men and women often bathed together, social hierarchies dissolved in the equalizing steam, and the relaxed atmosphere encouraged behaviors that stricter societies found threatening. When plague swept through Europe, bathhouses became convenient scapegoats, blamed for spreading disease through their communal waters and close contact. But the real reason for restricting bathhouses went deeper than moral panic or health concerns. They represented spaces where normal social control broke down, where the careful hierarchies that governed medieval life temporarily dissolved. In the steamy anonymity of communal baths, a merchant might find himself next to a noble, a servant beside her master, all equally vulnerable, equally human. The irony is profound. In attempting to control cleanliness, authorities may have made their societies less healthy. Private bathing required resources most people couldn't afford. Hauling water, heating it, finding space and time for washing. The decline of public bathhouses meant that many people simply stayed dirty, creating the stereotype of medieval uncleanliness that persists today. Yet even in this restriction, we see medieval wisdom at work. By making bathing a private family affair rather than a public social activity, authorities strengthened domestic bonds while weakening potentially disruptive public gatherings. The sacrifice of cleanliness was deemed worthwhile if it preserved social order. These weren't the only ways medieval law reached into the most personal aspects of human existence. Even death itself was regulated, governed by rules that determined not just how you died, but how your body would be treated afterward. Medieval burial laws reveal a society obsessed with spiritual geography. Where your body rested for eternity wasn't just about convenience or family preference. It was about the state of your soul and your relationship with divine authority. Consecrated ground within church walls was reserved for the most pious, the wealthy, the socially connected. Everyone else faced a hierarchy of afterlife real estate that reflected their earthly status. Suicides were banned from holy ground entirely, buried at crossroads where their restless spirits might be confused by multiple paths and unable to return to haunt the living. Criminals faced similar exclusion, their bodies often left to rot on gibbets as warnings to others. Even the manner of death determined burial options. Plague victims thrown into mass graves with quicklime, their individual identities dissolved in communal anonymity. But these harsh distinctions served purposes beyond mere social snobbery. They created powerful incentives for good behavior, reminders that earthly actions had eternal consequences. The threat of improper burial was often more terrifying than death itself, ensuring that people considered the spiritual implications of their choices. The story continues to unfold, revealing layer after layer of medieval logic hidden beneath seemingly arbitrary rules. Each law, each regulation, each strange custom emerged from a world that was simultaneously more dangerous and more interconnected than we can easily. The regulations surrounding medieval markets reveal another layer of this complex legal tapestry. Imagine arriving at a bustling town square on market day, your cart laden with goods you've traveled days to sell. But before you can offer a single item to eager customers, you must navigate a maze of rules that seem designed to frustrate commerce itself. First, the bell. No trading could begin until the market bell rang, usually at a specific hour determined by local authorities. Arrive early with superior goods? Too bad. Set up your stall in the prime location by the church steps? Not unless you've paid the exact fees in the exact order to the exact officials who control that coveted spot. Even the weights you use to measure your grain must be approved, stamped, and regularly inspected by market wardens who could shut down your entire operation with a single disapproving glance. These market laws seem like bureaucracy run amok, but they solved problems that could destroy entire communities. Without standardized weights, customers never knew if they were getting fair value. A pound of flour from one merchant might be significantly less than a pound from another, creating confusion, disputes, and violence. The approved weights ensured honesty in transactions, protecting both buyers and sellers from the chaos that dishonest trading could unleash. The controlled timing served even deeper purposes. Markets weren't just economic events. They were social gatherings where news traveled, alliances formed, and tensions could explode. By forcing everyone to begin trading simultaneously, authorities prevented early deals that might give some merchants unfair advantages, ensuring that competition remained relatively equal and reducing the resentment that could tear communities apart. But there's something almost ritualistic about these market openings. The bell would ring, and suddenly hundreds of people would burst into coordinated activity, like dancers responding to an invisible conductor. Goods would appear, money would change hands, conversations would bloom across language barriers. The forced synchronization created moments of pure human energy that transformed ordinary town squares into theaters of commerce and community. Even more intimate than trade was something that touched every medieval household. The simple act of brewing ale, that daily staple that provided both nutrition and safety in a world where water couldn't be trusted. Yet, even this most domestic of activities fell under the watchful eye of medieval law. The alewife, typically the woman of the household responsible for brewing, operated under regulations that would astound modern home brewers. Her ale had to meet specific standards of strength, taste, and purity. Too weak, and she faced fines for cheating customers. Too strong, and she risked accusations of encouraging drunkenness and disorder. The authorities would taste her product, judge its quality, and set the price she could charge, all while she bore the costs of ingredients, fuel, and labor. These brewing laws weren't about controlling women, though they certainly had that effect. They were about ensuring that communities had access to safe, reliable nutrition. Ale wasn't just an alcoholic beverage, it was liquid bread, packed with calories and vitamins that kept people alive when food was scarce. Bad ale could poison entire neighborhoods, while good ale could sustain them through famines and sieges. The ale stake, a wooden pole thrust into the ground outside homes where ale was sold, became a symbol of community trust. When the stake appeared, neighbors knew they could find honest drink and honest dealing. The alewife's reputation wasn't just personal, it was professional. backed by legal standards that protected everyone who depended on her product. Yet these laws also created opportunities. Skilled alewives could build thriving businesses, accumulating wealth and influence that might otherwise be denied to women in medieval society. The best brewers became local celebrities, their ales sought after by travelers and nobles alike. Legal regulation, ironically, provided a path to female entrepreneurship in a world that offered few such opportunities. But perhaps the strangest regulations of all governed something that seems purely personal, the very clothes people wore to bed. Sleep, that most private of human activities, was subject to laws that reveal medieval anxieties about everything from fire safety to moral purity. Night clothes weren't just about comfort or warmth. They were regulated garments that reflected social status, marital condition, and even spiritual state. Unmarried women faced restrictions on the fabrics they could wear while sleeping, lest their nightgowns be too alluring or expensive. Married couples had their own rules about appropriate sleepwear, designed to encourage procreation while discouraging unseemly pleasure. The strangest of these laws concerned sleeping caps, those practical head coverings that kept people warm during cold medieval nights. Different regions mandated different styles, colors, and materials based on the wearer's age, gender, and social position. A merchant's wife might be required to wear linen, while a noble's daughter slept in silk. Even the way the cap was tied carried meaning, advertising the wearer's availability for marriage or their adheros. These seemingly ridiculous regulations aren't immediately obvious. In crowded medieval households where multiple families might share sleeping spaces, standardized nightwear helped maintain social boundaries even in the intimate darkness of bedtime. The caps prevented the spread of lice and other parasites that thrived in unwashed hair, while the fabric regulations ensured that people didn't bankrupt themselves on unnecessary luxury. But there's something almost touching about these nighttime laws. They reveal a society that cared deeply about the most vulnerable moments of human existence. When people were defenseless, unconscious, trusting in their communities to protect them while they slept. The regulations weren't just about control. They were about creating safe spaces where rest could happen without fear. Even more fundamental than sleep was the medieval understanding of sickness and healing. Medical practice operated under legal frameworks that seem primitive to modern eyes, but which addressed real problems in communities where disease could spread with terrifying speed. Physicians needed licenses, not because medieval authorities understood germ theory, but because they recognized that bad medical advice could kill entire families. The licensing process involved testing, apprenticeship, and ongoing supervision that ensured practitioners met minimum standards of competence. Unlicensed healers faced severe penalties, not from professional jealousy, but from genuine concern about public safety. The laws governing apothecaries were even more detailed. Every herb, powder, and potion had to meet specific standards of purity and potency. Measurements were standardized, ingredients verified, and preparations tested by authorized officials who could shut down shops that sold dangerous or ineffective remedies. What seems like excessive regulation was actually medieval Europe's version of pharmaceutical quality control. These medical laws also protected patients from exploitation. Prices were controlled, preventing physicians from gouging desperate families during plague outbreaks. Treatment protocols were standardized, ensuring that the poor received the same basic care as the wealthy. The regulations weren't perfect, but they represented genuine attempts to make healing accessible and affordable for everyone. Yet perhaps most revealing of all were the laws that governed what we might call emotional crimes. Medieval authorities recognized that psychological harm could be as destructive as physical violence, leading to regulations that seem surprisingly modern in their understanding of human nature. Gossip, that seemingly harmless social activity, was treated as seriously as theft or assault in many medieval communities. Spreading rumors, particularly about women's virtue or men's business dealings, could result in public punishment, fines, or even exile. The stocks weren't just for thieves and drunks. They were for people whose words had caused social harm. These anti-gossip laws weren't about suppressing free speech, a concept that wouldn't emerge for centuries. They were about protecting community cohesion in small societies where reputation meant everything. A false rumor could destroy a merchant's business, prevent a young woman from marrying, or create feuds that might last generations. By treating harmful speech as a crime, authorities preserved the trust that allowed medieval communities to function. The punishments often fit the crime in ways that seem almost poetic. A gossip might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, a metal contraption that prevented speech while advertising the wearer's offense. Public humiliation served both as punishment and as warning, reminding everyone of the power words held to build or destroy. These speech laws also revealed medieval understanding of the relationship between language and reality. Words weren't just sounds or symbols, they were forces that could reshape the world, creating or destroying relationships, reputations, and entire social structures. By regulating speech, authorities were trying to control the very building blocks of their society. As night deepens and our journey through these strange laws continues, we begin to see the underlying pattern that connects them all. Each regulation, no matter how bizarre it might seem to modern eyes, emerged from a world where individual actions had community consequences, where personal choices could affect entire populations, where survival itself depended on everyone following rules that had been tested through generations of trial and error. The medieval world was simultaneously more connected and more fragile than ours. A single person's mistake could doom their neighbors, while collective adherence to seemingly arbitrary rules could save entire communities from disasters we can barely imagine. These weren't the products of primitive minds, but of sophisticated societies that had learned to navigate dangers we've forgotten ever existed. The story of medieval law is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, about communities that found ways to survive and thrive in circumstances that would challenge even our modern resources. Every strange regulation tells us something profound about the people who created it, about their fears and hopes, their understanding of human nature, and their determination to build societies that could endure whatever challenges the world might bring. Perhaps no medieval regulations seem stranger to modern minds than those governing the simple act of making bread. Yet these laws reveal some of the most sophisticated economic thinking of the age, disguised as mere culinary control. Picture yourself as a baker in 14th century Paris. Before dawn breaks, you're already kneading dough by candlelight, but every ingredient, every technique, every loaf you produce is governed by rules so detailed they would make modern health inspectors weep with envy. The weight of your bread must be exact to the grain. The color must fall within approved ranges. Even the shape of your loaves is dictated by municipal law. Sell a loaf that's too light, and you'll find yourself dragged before the bread court, a specialized tribunal that dealt exclusively with violations of baking regulations. The punishment wasn't just a fine. You might be forced to walk through the streets wearing a necklace of your defective loaves, advertising your shame to every potential customer. Repeat the offense, and you could lose your license to bake entirely, condemning your family to poverty in a world where few other trades were available. These bread laws weren't born from bureaucratic madness. They emerged from hard experience with famine, fraud, and social unrest. Bread was life itself to medieval people, providing up to 80% of their daily calories. When bakers cheated on weight or quality, they weren't just stealing money and it's from families already living from customers. They were stealing sustenance on the edge of starvation. The regulations also prevented the kind of bread riots that could tear cities apart. When people discovered they'd been sold sawdust mixed with flour or loaves that weighed half what they'd paid for, their anger could explode into violence that consumed entire neighborhoods. The bread courts, harsh as they seemed, were actually mechanisms of social peace, ensuring that this most essential commodity remained honest and available. But there's something almost sacred about how medieval societies treated bread making. The process was ritualized, surrounded by customs that transformed simple baking into a form of community service. The first loaf of each day was often donated to the poor. The ovens, too expensive for individual ownership, were shared resources where neighbors gathered, creating bonds over the shared warmth and the ancient miracle of grain becoming sustenance. Even stranger were the laws governing another necessity we take for granted. Salt, that simple mineral that preserved food and flavored meals, was controlled more tightly than gold in many medieval kingdoms. The salt roads were patrolled by armed guards. The salt warehouses were fortified like castles, and unauthorized salt trading was punished as severely as treason. So here we are, having traveled through a world that seems alien to our modern sensibilities, yet reveals itself to be startlingly familiar in its underlying concerns. Every bizarre medieval law we've encountered tonight, from the bread regulations that could destroy a baker's life to the clothing restrictions that marked social boundaries, tells the same fundamental story. These weren't the products of primitive or cruel minds. They were the desperate innovations of communities fighting for survival against odds we can barely comprehend. The medieval world was a place where individual choices rippled outward with consequences that could affect entire populations. A single contaminated loaf could poison a neighborhood. One person wearing the wrong colors could trigger social unrest. An unregulated market could collapse local economies overnight. What seems like oppressive control was actually sophisticated crisis management developed by societies that understood how quickly order could dissolve into chaos. Perhaps most remarkably, these laws reveal that human nature hasn't changed as much as we might think. Medieval people faced the same fundamental challenges we do today, ensuring fair trade, maintaining social stability, protecting public health, managing resources. They simply did so with the tools available to them, creating solutions that worked within their technological and social limitations. As you go about your daily life, remember that our modern freedoms rest on invisible infrastructures of regulation, technology, and abundance that medieval people could never have imagined. Their strange laws weren't barriers to human flourishing. They were the very foundations that made survival possible in a world where survival was never guaranteed. The next time something seems inexplicably harsh or unfair in history, ask yourself what problem it was trying to solve. The answer might surprise you with its wisdom.